This is Did You Know? CIUS Answers, a daily response to your questions about Russia's war against Ukraine. In response to the strong public interest to understand what is happening in Ukraine right now, CIUS experts are answering your questions. Answering your question today is Dr. Natalia Khanenko-Friesen. Dr. Khanenko-Friesen is a cultural anthropologist, a professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies at the University of Alberta. She holds the position of Hutsulak Chair at the Cool Ukrainian Folklore Center and is the current director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. Natalia, can you please explain why, when we refer to the capital city of Ukraine, we say Kyiv and not Kiev?
This is a very good question to address. It's been on the tips of our tongues, Kyiv versus Kiev. With Russia's most recent assault and now, of course, full-scale war on Ukraine, the world has turned its attention on Ukraine. Everybody around the world is now paying attention to what's going on in the country. And the name of the capital, Kyiv, is on many people's minds, and we can say on many journalists' tongues these days. So in this short episode of Did You Know CIUS Answers, let's just briefly consider why should we be saying and writing Kyiv instead of habitual Kiev. So by now, most people know that Kyiv is the Ukrainian word and Kiev is the Russian word. Ukrainians have been using the word Kyiv as the name for their capital for as long as they've been speaking Ukrainian language, but the familiar orthographic rendition of the word in the Ukrainian language formalized at the end of the 19th century when, in 1873, letter E, as we call it, E with double two dots, was added to the Ukrainian alphabet. And at the same time, Westerners and those in the English-speaking world for years have been using the Russian word Kiev. Perhaps many by now realize that Kiev is the Russian word. This old habit of ours using the Russian language word when speaking about the capital of Ukraine perhaps has something to do with the Western reluctance to transition from the old usage to the new one. After all, in English, according to some sources, Kiev was used in print as early as 1804. But perhaps it also has to do something with the history of Ukraine. Ukraine has been under the Russian rule since the late 17th century, and in the 20th century, it was part of the Soviet Union, in which, again, the Russian language continued to dominate all spheres of cultural and political life. And topographic names of many Soviet cities were rendered in English on the basis of how these names sounded in the Russian language and also how they were written in the Russian language. So when Ukraine gained its independence in 1991, the Ukrainian government, of course, attempted to introduce proper Ukrainian transliteration, Kyiv, into the English-speaking world. And it had tried to make Kyiv more widely used abroad. But it's only perhaps after the Euromaidan of 2014, after the illegal annexation of Crimea and other parts of Eastern Ukraine by the Russian Federation, that the Ukrainian government returned to these efforts. And in 2019, for example, the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs have revived the campaign to persuade the West and the world outside of Ukraine to use Kyiv, deriving from the Ukrainian language name Kyiv, instead of Kiev, coming from the Russian language. And since this campaign's launch, we've seen much progress and much success in this particular undertaking. For example, 63 airports around the world, as of January 2020, have begun using the name Kyiv in their systems. And importantly, the digital world also was catching up. It's transitioning or has already transitioned for most to a new usage. You can easily Google up Kyiv on Google Maps. You can book your accommodations for Kyiv. You can book your flights for Kyiv by typing up exactly the Ukrainian transliteration of the name of Ukrainian capital. Importantly, what we want to remember also that this particular move towards toponym indigenization of a geographic name Kyiv reflects the global trend towards decolonization of indigenous geographies and topographies. We have seen renamings of many other cities within other former colonies of larger empires. Think, for example, of Irish cities, the one being brought back into the Irish Gaelic, for example, Londonderry became, again, Derry. And in Canada, we also are quite well exposed to this particular transition. We've seen many Indigenous names being introduced into the daily usage of our own in English. For example, many of us know Churchill River by its new name, Mississippi River. And in case of Kyiv, because Russian language and Ukrainian language has shared many phonetic and orthographic features, the change may not be as noticeable as, say, for example, the change from the Mount McKinley in Alaska, which nowadays is known as Mount Denali. But this change reflects, nonetheless, the same attempt to shed colonial and imperial legacy that had marked the development of Ukrainian society and culture for a long period of time, but especially since the country gained its independence about 30-some years ago. Well, all this is good, but how do you pronounce Kyiv, and how do you make it sound as native Ukrainians would make it sound? So the word Kyiv in Ukrainian contains two distinct syllables. Therefore, it also contains two distinct vowels. Kyiv has two vowels, U and Yiv. So let's consider those vowels. Native speakers, when they will be pronouncing the first vowel, U, will probably say it very similarly to me, U. It's a bit of a sound position sort of coming from the back of my throat, U. It's not an easy sound to pronounce for the English speakers. Therefore, when we are to find the equivalent of the pronunciation of the first vowel, we would turn to such words as lit, bit, kit, kiss, and so on and so forth. So the first syllable, therefore, should sound K. And as far as the second vowel here is concerned, it's a bit more of an interesting sound, Yi in Yiv. We will render it in English with the help of the letter I, but Yiv in English will be pronounced as the sound Yi in the word yield. So the sound E in the second syllable, Eve, should sound more like Yiv, Yi in yield. It is a compound sound and consists of Y and E. So therefore, when I pronounce the word Kyiv, I clearly make a differentiation in my head and in my sound between the two self-standing syllables, Kyiv. And by the way, you'd like to stress this word and put in stress on the first syllable, Kyiv, Kyiv. The consonants, on the other hand, are said and pronounced the same way as we would pronounce them in English. K and V sound very similar to how they would sound in English. And the sound V at the very end doesn't really become F or doesn't get softened to an F, just because Ukrainian language is a phonetic language and tends to use the same sounds for the same letters throughout any place these letters appear in the word. And oftentimes it doesn't matter whether the word or rather the syllable is stressed or not. Of course, there are exceptions, but for our purpose today, let's just remember that Ukrainian language is phonetic and retains these sounds as they are written out all the time from place to place. But ultimately, coming back to how you'd like to pronounce the word Kyiv is rather simple, Kyiv, and I'll make it again sound like one word, Kyiv. Now, let us all wish luck to use this new word in the phrase chicken a la Kyiv.
Thank you, Natalia. And thank you to everyone who continues to send in their questions about Ukraine. We'll be back with more questions and answers.